I have lived on Brooks Ranch long enough to know that silence usually means everything is working exactly the way it should. At sunrise, the only sounds were the distant bawling of cattle, the wind moving through the live oaks, and the low, familiar hum drifting from the old pump house tucked beneath their branches. My mornings had followed the same routine for nearly 20 years. Coffee first, feed the horses, walk to the pump house with the same worn brass key my father carried before me. Unlock the steel door. Listen before touching anything. Dad always insisted the machinery would tell you when something was wrong long before a pressure gauge ever could. Most people watch numbers. He listened for rhythm. That Tuesday morning, the rhythm was perfect. Every bearing sounded smooth. Every gauge sat exactly where it belonged. I signed my maintenance log, closed the notebook, and rested my hand on the large isolation valve supplying Hollow Creek Meadows. I stood there for several seconds, remembering the last conversation I had with Vanessa Holloway. She had marched onto my ranch 6 months earlier, pointed at this very building, and confidently informed me that the Homeowners Association now owned it. According to her, Brooks Ranch had no authority over the pump house anymore. I had actually laughed because I thought she was making a joke. She wasn't. Since then, I had received certified letters demanding access, emails threatening legal action, and one particularly entertaining notice informing me that I needed HOA approval before entering the pump house my grandfather built. Yet every single time a storm knocked out power or a pump alarm went off in the middle of the night, my phone rang. Not the HOA's electrician, not their management company, mine. Apparently, I was qualified enough to repair their property, but not qualified enough to own it. That contradiction stayed with me for months until I finally realized arguing would never solve anything. Sometimes the fastest way to expose a bad assumption is to let it collide with reality. I wrapped both hands around the steel handle and slowly turned the valve closed. Nothing happened inside the ranch. The barn still had water. The livestock tanks remained full. The irrigation lines continued running. Only one pipe had been isolated, the one carrying water into the subdivision. I made one final note in my father's old maintenance notebook. Subdivision supply isolated. Ranch operations normal. Then I locked the pump house and started walking back toward the barn. I had barely reached the fence before my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen and smiled despite myself. Vanessa Holloway. Well, I muttered quietly. That took less than a minute. I answered. Morning, Vanessa. She skipped the greeting entirely. Nathan, what did you just do? I looked across the pasture where a young colt was unsuccessfully trying to convince an older mare to run with him. Fed the horses. Do not play games with me. Her voice was already rising. Every home in Hollow Creek just lost water. That's unfortunate. Turn it back on. Right now. I leaned against the weathered fence rail. I thought the HOA owned the water system. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough to tell me she knew exactly why I had done this. That is completely irrelevant. Seems pretty relevant to me. You are interfering with HOA property. Then why do you still need my key? Another pause. I could almost hear her searching for a response that made sense. Instead, she settled on confidence. If you don't restore service in the next 5 minutes, I'm calling the sheriff. Please do. Excuse me. I've been hoping someone with a badge would finally look at the paperwork instead of listening to neighborhood gossip. She hung up so hard the line clicked. Behind me, my foreman Caleb walked over carrying a fencing hammer across one shoulder. He had probably heard enough of my side of the conversation to understand what was happening. She threatening to sue you again? He asked. Sheriff this time. Caleb grinned. Moving up in the world. I laughed. Apparently. He looked toward the pump house. You sure about this? Very. Why? I glanced at the brass key still resting in my hand. Because if they really own that building. I slipped the key back into my pocket. They shouldn't need anything from me. Caleb nodded slowly. That's an expensive question. Sometimes the expensive questions get the honest answers. We didn't wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, SUVs began turning onto my gravel driveway one after another, throwing pale clouds of Texas dust into the morning air. Homeowners climbed out carrying coffee cups, bottled water, and enough certainty to convince themselves this day was already over. Several immediately started recording with their phones. Vanessa arrived first. She stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses and walked toward me without slowing down. Unlock the pump house, she demanded, pointing past me as though she were giving instructions to an employee. No. She blinked. Excuse me. No. You don't have a choice. Actually, I replied calmly. I think that's exactly what we're here to find out. She pointed toward the gate. That building belongs to the HOA. I smiled slightly. Funny thing about that. What? Yesterday somebody cut my lock off to get inside. Her expression changed for just an instant before she recovered. We inspected our property. Good, I said. Then you'll have no trouble proving it. Before she could answer, 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled through the ranch entrance, tires crunching across the gravel. The conversation stopped almost immediately. Even the people filming lowered their phones for a second. Deputies Miguel Ruiz and Sarah Collins stepped out, looked at the crowd gathered around the old pump house beneath the oak trees, then exchanged a quick glance that said exactly what I was thinking. This was going to be one of those calls nobody was going to forget. Deputy Miguel Ruiz rested one hand on his duty belt while quietly studying the scene in front of him. On one side of the gravel driveway stood nearly 24 frustrated homeowners. On the other stood a weathered concrete pump house, a cattle ranch, and one man holding a brass key. He glanced at Deputy Sarah Collins before speaking. All right, he said. Let's save ourselves some time. One person talks at a time. Vanessa stepped forward immediately, as though she had rehearsed this moment during the drive over. Deputy, this man deliberately shut off water to more than 200 families. Ruiz nodded without reacting. Your name? Vanessa Holloway, president of the Hollow Creek Meadows Homeowners Association. He made a quick note. And you believe this facility belongs to the HOA? I don't believe it. She folded her arms confidently. I know it. Ruiz turned toward me. Sir, Nathan Brooks, did you shut off the water? I closed one valve. Why? Because Ms. Holloway says the HOA owns the pump house. Ruiz looked back at Vanessa, then at me, then at the building sitting quietly beneath the live oaks. I'm missing something. You and me both, I replied. If they own it, they shouldn't need me to unlock it. A couple of homeowners exchanged uncertain looks. Ruiz took a few slow steps toward the chain-link gate surrounding the pump house. Mind opening it? Not at all. I pulled the brass key from my pocket and unlocked the gate. The heavy hinges groaned exactly the way they always had. Collins instinctively stepped in front of the growing crowd. Everyone else stays outside the fence. A few people protested, but one look from her ended the discussion. Inside, the familiar vibration of the electric motors filled the room. Sunlight slipped through the dusty windows, catching tiny particles floating in the air. Ruiz walked around the equipment without touching anything. He looked at the pressure gauges, the control panels, the electrical meters. Finally, he stopped beside the large isolation valve. This is the one. Yes. Everything else is still operating. The ranch never lost water. Collins looked toward the open doorway. Barn. Has water. Horse troughs. Full. Livestock tanks. All working. Ruiz nodded thoughtfully. So you didn't shut down the facility? No. I pointed toward the valve. I isolated one customer. That caught his attention. Customer. That's how I've always viewed the subdivision. Before Ruiz could respond, Vanessa interrupted from outside the doorway. They're not customers. They're homeowners. Both can be true, I answered. Ruiz held up one hand before the conversation turned into another argument. Let's stay with the facts. I walked over to an old wooden shelf and picked up a thick 3-ring binder covered in years of dust. The faded label simply read Pump House Records. I handed it to him. Start anywhere. He opened to the middle. Maintenance logs. Electrical inspections. Pump rebuilds. Pressure tests. Every page carried a date and a signature. Collins leaned over his shoulder. These records go back decades. My grandfather started the binder. I smiled. My father added to it. I've just been trying not to break the streak. Ruiz turned another page. Who paid for this motor replacement? Brooks Ranch. Another invoice. Electrical contractor? Brooks Ranch. Another. Emergency service call after lightning strike. Brooks Ranch. He looked up. Who pays the electric bill here? Before I answered, Vanessa spoke again. That has nothing to do with ownership. Ruiz didn't even look up from the paperwork. It has something to do with responsibility. I walked over to the electrical panel and pointed at the meter. That account has always been under Brooks Ranch Agricultural Services. Collins copied down the meter number into her notebook. We'll verify that with the utility company. Vanessa's confidence slipped just enough for people to notice. The HOA has maintained the system too. Ruiz finally looked at her. Do you have maintenance records? Our management company should. Did you bring them? No. Electric bills? No. Repair invoices? Not with me. The silence after that answer felt much louder than the machinery humming around us. An older homeowner standing just outside the doorway frowned. Wait a minute. Everyone turned toward him. I've lived here 38 years. He looked at Vanessa. Every time something broke, wasn't it Nathan who came out here? Another resident nodded slowly. Last winter too, during that freeze. A woman standing behind them added. And after the tornado warning a few years ago. The realization moved through the crowd, one quiet conversation at a time. Nobody sounded angry. They sounded confused. Ruiz closed the binder and handed it back to me. Mr. Brooks, you mentioned someone cut your lock. Yesterday. Yes. I reached beneath the workbench and picked up the broken padlock. The steel shackle had been sliced clean through with bolt cutters. Ruiz turned it over carefully. Fresh cut. Yesterday morning. Collins examined the damaged metal. Did you report it? No. Ruiz raised an eyebrow. Most people would have. Probably. Why didn't you? I looked toward the open doorway where Vanessa and the board members were standing. Because I had a feeling whoever cut that lock believed they had every right to do it. Ruiz waited. And I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked it, and opened a security app. I wanted to see whether they were willing to make that mistake on camera. I held up the screen. Deputy. The first video thumbnail showed the front gate of the pump house with a timestamp from the previous morning. I've got 6 security cameras covering this building, and I think you're about to recognize a few familiar faces. Deputy Ruiz looked at the phone in my hand, then at the broken padlock resting on the workbench. You have surveillance cameras? He asked. 6, I replied. Every entrance, every gate, every angle around the pump house. For the first time that morning, Vanessa's confidence wavered. It lasted less than a second, but I caught it. She had walked onto my ranch expecting an argument. She hadn't expected evidence. Ruiz nodded toward the screen. Let's see it. I selected the recording from the previous morning. The video opened with a wide shot of the front gate. A white SUV rolled slowly onto the ranch road before stopping beside the fence. The timestamp read 9:17 a.m. 3 people stepped out. One remained beside the vehicle, looking back toward the county road every few seconds. The other 2 walked directly to the gate carrying a pair of bolt cutters. Nobody knocked. Nobody called. Nobody even looked toward the ranch house. One squeeze of the handles echoed through the phone's speaker. Clang. The cut padlock hit the gravel exactly where Deputy Collins was now standing. The gate swung open, and the 2 men disappeared inside the pump house while the third continued acting as a lookout. They stayed for nearly 7 minutes before locking the gate with a completely different padlock and driving away. Nobody inside the real pump house said a word while the recording played. Even the electric motors seemed quieter. Ruiz held out his hand. Play it again. This time I enlarged the image as the SUV stopped. The camera resolution was clear enough to read the license plate and recognize every face. Someone standing outside the fence whispered, "That's Tom." Another homeowner answered almost immediately. "Greg's with him." Both men happened to be sitting HOA board members. A woman standing near Vanessa slowly lowered the phone she'd been using to record everything. Ruiz paused the video on a clear frame showing the bolt cutters closing around the lock. "Mr. Brooks," he asked, "did you give either of these men permission to enter your property?" "No." "Did anyone notify you they planned to inspect the facility?" "No." Collins looked toward Vanessa. "Were you aware they were coming here?" Vanessa hesitated just long enough to notice several homeowners watching her instead of me. I knew the board wanted to inspect the pump house. Ruiz kept his voice calm. "Did you authorize them to cut the lock?" She looked toward Tom before answering. "I told them they had every right to inspect HOA property." Ruiz didn't argue. He simply slipped the broken padlock into an evidence bag and handed it to Collins. "Please tag that." Then he looked back at me. "We'll need copies of these recordings." "Already saved on a backup drive," I replied. Caleb smiled from outside the fence. "Nathan backs up everything twice." 3 times, I corrected. Dad never trusted hard drives. That earned a quiet laugh from one of the deputies. While Collins copied the video files, Ruiz walked slowly around the outside of the pump house. He studied the foundation, the fencing, the electrical service entrance, and the weathered concrete walls. When he rounded the southwest corner, He stopped so suddenly that Collins looked up from the tablet. Sarah. She walked over. Half hidden behind a thick vine was an old brass plaque that decades of weather had turned almost brown. Ruiz brushed away the dust with his hand until the lettering became readable. Brooks Ranch Water Facility. Established 1981. Collins tilted her head. Looks original. It is, I answered. My grandfather mounted it after construction was finished. An older homeowner near the gate suddenly laughed to himself. I'd forgotten about that plaque. Ruiz looked over. You've seen it before? Hundreds of times. The man smiled as memories returned. When we bought our place back in '83, those oak trees were barely taller than me. You could read that sign from the road. He pointed toward the building. Everybody used to call it the Brooks Pump House. A younger homeowner frowned. Then when did it become the HOA Pump House? The older man shrugged. Honestly, I don't remember. Somewhere along the way people just started saying it, and nobody questioned it. Ruiz rested one hand against the weathered concrete wall. Interesting. He wasn't talking about the plaque anymore. He was thinking about assumptions. He pulled out his phone and called the county recorder's office. After identifying himself, he read the parcel number posted beside the gate and requested every recorded document connected to the property. We waited while the clerk searched the archives. Finally, he thanked her, ended the call, and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Collins looked at him expectantly. Find anything? Ruiz nodded slowly. The county located the original development records from 1981. Vanessa folded her arms again, confidence beginning to return. Then this should be over. Ruiz shook his head. Not quite. Why not? Because the clerk found documents giving the subdivision the right to receive water. He paused just long enough for everyone to lean in. What she didn't find. He looked toward the old pump house beneath the live oaks. Was a recorded deed transferring ownership of this facility from Brooks Ranch to the HOA. The crowd fell silent again. Ruiz glanced at the notification that had just appeared on his phone. The county had started uploading the archived files. He looked back at me with a faint smile. Mr. Brooks. He held up the phone. I have a feeling the next document is going to answer a question that's been confusing this neighborhood for over 40 years. Nobody moved. The excitement that had filled the ranch when the deputies first arrived had quietly turned into something else entirely. Curiosity. Homeowners who had shown up expecting to watch me get ordered around were now standing beneath the live oaks waiting for county records to load onto a deputy's phone. Caleb leaned against the fence beside me and tipped his hat back. I've never seen people so interested in paperwork. I smiled. Most folks aren't. They just don't realize paperwork usually decides who wins long before lawyers get involved. Deputy Ruiz's phone chimed. An email from the county recorder had arrived with several scanned documents attached. He opened the first file while Collins stepped beside him. The heading read Original Boundary Survey, Hollow Creek Meadows Development, 1981. Ruiz slowly zoomed in until the parcel lines became clear. Thick black lines outlined Brooks Ranch. A smaller shaded section identified the subdivision. Near the center of the ranch property sat a small rectangular structure labeled Water Production Facility. Collins traced the property line with her finger. There's no question where the building sits. No, Ruiz agreed. It's entirely inside Brooks Ranch. Vanessa folded her arms. Location doesn't prove ownership. Ruiz nodded without arguing. You're right. He locked the screen for a second. But it tells us where to keep looking. He opened the next attachment. Across the top of the first page were the words Operating Agreement between Brooks Ranch and Hollow Creek Meadows Development Company. The document had been typed on an old typewriter, complete with slightly uneven letters and faded ink around the edges. Ruiz quietly read the first page to himself. Halfway down, he stopped. He read the paragraph again. This time, even Collins noticed. Something important? She asked. Ruiz didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed her the tablet and pointed at one section. She read silently for several seconds before looking up at me. Have you seen this before? Years ago, I answered. My father made me read every document related to the ranch after I took over. Caleb chuckled. I remember that week. Nathan complained more about paperwork than he ever complained about fixing fences. Dad said if I inherited the land, I inherited the responsibility to understand it. Ruiz closed the tablet for a moment and faced the crowd. I'm going to read part of this agreement aloud. Every conversation stopped. Even the people standing near the road wandered closer. Ruiz began reading slowly. Brooks Ranch shall continue supplying water to Hollow Creek Meadows under the terms described herein. Several homeowners nodded. That part sounded exactly like what everyone already believed. Then Ruiz continued. Brooks Ranch shall retain exclusive responsibility for operation, maintenance, repair, electrical service, and physical control of the water production facility located upon Brooks Ranch property. The words seemed to hang in the warm morning air. Nobody interrupted him. He looked back down at the page. The developer and all future property owners within Hollow Creek Meadows shall assume responsibility only for the distribution system located inside subdivision boundaries. An older homeowner frowned. Distribution system? Collins answered before Ruiz could. The neighborhood pipes, fire hydrants, local valves, everything after the main connection. The man slowly looked toward the pump house beneath the oak trees. So, he paused, trying to process it. We maintained our pipes. Yes, Collins replied. That doesn't necessarily mean you maintain the source. Another homeowner quietly asked. Then who was paying for the pump? Nobody answered right away. Instead, Ruiz looked toward me. I walked over to my truck, opened the passenger door, and carried back another weathered storage box. Inside were neatly organized folders labeled electrical bills, pump repairs, motor replacements, and annual maintenance. I handed the first folder to Ruiz. He flipped through the invoices. Every utility bill listed the same customer. Brooks Ranch Agricultural Services. Collins opened another folder. Emergency pump rebuild after a lightning strike. Paid by Brooks Ranch. New control panel. Paid by Brooks Ranch. Replacement motor bearings. Paid by Brooks Ranch. She looked at me. You kept every receipt? Dad kept every receipt. I smiled. I just kept copying him. Several homeowners began quietly talking among themselves. One woman looked genuinely confused. Then what exactly have our HOA dues been paying for? A retired plumber standing near the gate answered before anyone else could. The neighborhood side of the system. He scratched his chin thoughtfully. I just assumed the pump house came with it. Ruiz nodded. Assumptions have a way of lasting a long time if nobody checks the original records. Vanessa remained silent. The confidence she had shown that morning was fading with every page the deputies opened. Ruiz returned to the operating agreement and continued reading until he reached another paragraph. This time he slowed down even more. No ownership of the water production facility shall transfer except through a separately executed and properly recorded conveyance filed with the county recorder. He looked up at Collins. That's the document the county clerk couldn't find. Collins nodded. Because she says it doesn't exist. Almost on cue, Ruiz's phone chimed again. Another attachment had just finished downloading from the county archive. The file name read Developer Closing Affidavit, December 1981. Ruiz opened the first page, read the opening paragraph, and stopped. He didn't say a word for several long seconds. Finally, he looked toward me with an expression that had changed from curiosity to certainty. Mr. Brooks, he said quietly, I think this affidavit is about to answer the one question nobody in this neighborhood realized they should have been asking for the last 40 years. Deputy Ruiz looked at the file name for a moment before opening it. Developer Closing Affidavit, December 1981. The scanned pages were old enough that the county seal had faded, but every signature remained perfectly legible. He read the first paragraph silently, then handed the tablet to Deputy Collins. She barely reached the middle of the page before stopping exactly where Ruiz had. Neither deputy spoke for several seconds. The homeowners standing nearby leaned forward, trying to read their expressions instead of the document itself. Finally, Collins looked up. This isn't introducing anything new, she said quietly. It's confirming everything we've already found. Ruiz nodded once. Exactly. He turned the screen so everyone closest to him could see the heading before reading aloud. The developer hereby certifies completion of the Hollow Creek Meadows water distribution system. Brooks Ranch shall continue ownership, operation, maintenance, electrical service, and physical control of the existing water production facility pursuant to the operating agreement executed earlier this year. He paused, then continued. Responsibility accepted by the subdivision shall begin at the master connection point and include only those distribution facilities located within subdivision boundaries. One homeowner blinked in surprise. So the neighborhood accepted the pipes. Ruiz finished the thought. Not the pump house. The man slowly nodded. I don't know how we all missed that. Because, an older woman answered from the back of the crowd. Most of us never read it. Nobody argued with her. Ruiz scrolled farther down the affidavit until another paragraph caught his attention. Listen to this. He cleared his throat and read carefully. No conveyance of the water production facility has been executed as of the date of this affidavit. Ownership remains vested in Brooks Ranch unless transferred through a separately recorded instrument. He lowered the tablet and looked directly at Collins. That's the second document saying exactly the same thing. Collins nodded. Independent documents drafted at different stages of the project, which makes them much harder to dismiss. Vanessa finally stepped forward again. Her voice was noticeably quieter than it had been an hour earlier. Deputy, is there any chance another document was simply lost? Ruiz answered honestly. Anything is possible. Then he added, but county staff searched the title history, the recorder's index, archived development files, and every referenced instrument connected to this parcel. He gently tapped the tablet. So far, every record points in the same direction. I had remained silent through most of the morning, but at that moment I walked back to my truck and lifted out one final storage box. Caleb smiled the second he saw it. You brought that one too? Figured I might need it. Inside were decades of utility statements, contractor invoices, tax records, and insurance renewals, all organized by year. I handed the oldest folder to Ruiz. These begin in 1982. He opened the first invoice. Monthly electrical service. Customer, Brooks Ranch Agricultural Services. The next folder contained annual pump inspections. Same customer. Then liability insurance covering the pump house. Same customer. Collins picked up another folder labeled property taxes. She flipped through several years before stopping. The pump house improvements are assessed as part of Brooks Ranch. She looked toward Vanessa. Has the HOA ever paid property taxes on this building? Vanessa slowly shook her head. Not that I'm aware of. An older homeowner standing near the fence suddenly laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. We've spent 40 years believing we owned something we never insured, never taxed, never powered, and apparently never repaired. A few people smiled awkwardly. Others simply stared at the folders spread across the hood of my truck. Ruiz closed the final file. Mr. Brooks. Yes. Your father was remarkably organized. I looked down at the handwritten labels on the folders. He used to tell me that every receipt was part of the ranch's memory. Caleb chuckled. Nathan hated filing paperwork. Still do. That drew a few genuine laughs from the crowd, breaking the tension for the first time all morning. Ruiz smiled before becoming serious again. Sometimes people think ownership is proven by who talks the loudest. He placed one hand on the stack of documents. In reality, ownership is usually proven by who quietly keeps the records. He stepped away for a moment and called the county recorder one last time. After confirming the affidavit number, the parcel references, and the absence of any later conveyance, he ended the call and slipped his notebook into his back pocket. Then he faced the homeowners. Based on the survey, the operating agreement, the developer closing affidavit, utility records, maintenance records, tax assessments, and everything reviewed by the county today, I have found no evidence that ownership of this water production facility ever left Brooks Ranch. A heavy silence settled across the ranch. No one looked at me anymore. Every eye had shifted toward Vanessa and the HOA board members. Ruiz continued in the same calm tone. The subdivision clearly has contractual rights to receive water. That has never been in question. He glanced toward the old pump house beneath the live oaks. Ownership is a different matter. Then he reached into the evidence bag and held up the cut padlock one more time. Which means we now have one remaining issue to resolve. He looked directly at the two board members captured on the security footage. Because if this facility belongs to Brooks Ranch, his voice remained calm, but the question carried across the entire driveway. I need to determine why this lock was cut and who believed they had the legal authority to do it. Deputy Ruiz held the broken padlock in one hand while looking at the two HOA board members standing a few feet away. The entire ranch had gone quiet again. Even the homeowners who had spent the morning whispering among themselves were now waiting to hear what happened next. Ruiz's voice remained calm. Tom, Greg, I'd like you both to step over here. Neither man argued. They walked forward slowly, looking very different from the confident figures I had watched on the security footage the day before. Ruiz opened his notebook. Let's start with something simple. Did either of you cut this lock? Tom looked down before answering. Yes. Ruiz nodded once. Who brought the bolt cutters? Greg slowly raised his hand. I did. Ruiz wrote another note. Did Mr. Brooks give either of you permission to enter this property? No. Did either of you notify him beforehand? No. Ruiz looked up. Then why did you believe you could enter? Tom glanced toward Vanessa before speaking. Because we were told the pump house belonged to the HOA. Ruiz followed his eyes to Vanessa. Ms. Holloway. She stepped forward. Yes. Did you tell these gentlemen the HOA owned this facility? She answered carefully. Yes. Did you instruct them to inspect it? Yes. Ruiz waited one more second before asking the question everyone expected. Did you authorize them to remove the lock if necessary? Vanessa looked at the gravel for a long moment. I told them to get inside. Nobody moved. The answer settled over the crowd like dust after a passing truck. Ruiz finally closed his notebook. Thank you for being honest. Collins finished labeling the evidence bag before walking over beside him. Ruiz addressed the board members again. Based on everything we've confirmed today, you entered private property without the owner's permission after cutting a secured lock. Greg looked genuinely shaken. Deputy, we honestly believed it belonged to us. Ruiz nodded. I believe that. He paused before continuing. Believing something isn't a crime. Acting on a belief that turns out to be wrong can become one. The words were not harsh. They were simply factual. He turned toward me. Mr. Brooks. Yes. Would you like to pursue criminal charges for the damaged lock and the unauthorized entry? Every person standing outside the pump house looked at me. Even Caleb stopped leaning against the fence. I glanced toward the broken padlock resting inside the evidence bag. It had cost less than $50. The arguments surrounding it had probably cost everyone involved months of unnecessary frustration. Dad always believed there was a difference between winning and making someone lose. I looked back at Ruiz. No. Several people blinked in surprise. Ruiz gave me a chance to reconsider. You're certain? I didn't shut off the water to punish anyone. I looked toward the homeowners. I shut it off because I wanted the truth to come out before lawyers spent another year arguing over assumptions. Tom took one slow step toward me. Nathan. His voice sounded completely different now. I'm sorry. Greg nodded immediately. So am I. I believed them. They had followed the wrong instructions, but nothing I had seen suggested they were trying to steal anything for themselves. Replace the lock, I said. Stay off my property without permission. That's enough for me. Caleb smiled quietly beside the fence. Your father would have said exactly the same thing. Ruiz closed his notebook. Very well. He looked toward the two board members. Mr. Brooks has chosen not to pursue criminal charges. Consider yourselves fortunate. Then he turned toward Vanessa. His tone remained respectful, but noticeably firmer. Ma'am, until your attorney completes an independent review of these documents, I strongly recommend the HOA stop representing this pump house as association property. She nodded slowly. We will. Ruiz continued. And if anyone returns to this facility without permission after today, this office will not view it as a misunderstanding. Nobody needed him to explain what that meant. Collins handed preliminary incident summaries to both sides before returning to the patrol car. Around us, the mood had completely changed. Earlier that morning, homeowners had arrived expecting to watch deputies order me to restore water. Instead, they had watched 40 years of assumptions quietly collapse beneath county records, maintenance logs, tax documents, and one old brass plaque hidden beneath a climbing vine. An older homeowner slowly walked across the gravel driveway, removed his baseball cap, and held out his hand. Nathan, I owe you an apology. I shook it. For what? For telling my neighbors that this place belonged to the HOA. He looked toward the pump house. Turns out I never knew the whole story. A woman standing beside him smiled awkwardly. Neither did the rest of us. One by one, more homeowners crossed the driveway. Some thanked me for keeping the water running all those years. Others admitted they had never realized Brooks Ranch had been paying every electric bill and every repair invoice. Nobody came over to argue anymore. They came to ask questions, and for the first time, they seemed more interested in the answers than the rumors. Vanessa remained beside her SUV, quietly watching the conversations unfold. A week earlier, Every homeowner in that crowd would have accepted her word without question. Now they wanted to see the documents for themselves. As Deputy Ruiz climbed into his cruiser, he lowered the driver's window and looked back toward me. "Mr. Brooks." "Yes, Deputy." A faint smile crossed his face. "I've handled property disputes for nearly 15 years. He glanced toward the stack of maintenance notebooks sitting on the hood of my truck. "I don't think I've ever seen a family win one with better records than yours." I looked down at my father's handwriting on the cover of the oldest notebook and smiled. Neither did he. The deputies pulled away slowly, leaving behind a ranch that felt strangely quieter than it had at sunrise. Dust settled across the gravel driveway while the last homeowners lingered beneath the shade of the live oaks, talking in smaller groups than before. Earlier that morning, everyone had seemed certain they already knew the truth. Now they were comparing pieces of it, fitting together details that should have been obvious years ago. Caleb began gathering the folding table we'd used for the documents. "Well," he said with a grin, "that didn't go quite the way the HOA expected." I stacked the maintenance binders back into their storage box. "Probably not. You think they're finally done?" I looked toward Vanessa, who was still standing beside her SUV, speaking quietly with the remaining board members. "No." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Really? People rarely spend months convincing themselves they're right, and then change their minds in one afternoon." He nodded slowly. "Fair point." Before we could carry the last box back to my truck, someone called my name. "Nathan." I turned to see Tom and Greg walking toward me without the confidence they'd shown on the security footage. Neither man looked particularly comfortable. Tom stopped a few feet away. "You got a minute?" "Sure." He took a slow breath. "I wanted to apologize again." He glanced toward the pump house. "Not just for the lock." Greg nodded beside him. "We honestly thought we were protecting HOA property." "I know." Tom shook his head. "That's the embarrassing part. We never asked for proof." He laughed once, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Vanessa said the pump house belonged to the association, and we just accepted it." I closed the storage box and rested my hands on the lid. Most people trust the folks they elect. Greg looked down at the gravel. "We should have trusted the paperwork instead." None of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Tom reached into his pocket and held out a small envelope. "This covers the lock." I looked inside. There was enough cash to replace it several times over. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah," he replied quietly. "We did." I accepted the envelope without counting the money. It wasn't about the amount. It was about taking responsibility. As the two men started walking back toward the subdivision, Greg stopped and looked over his shoulder. "For what it's worth." He smiled awkwardly. "Thanks for not pressing charges. Just don't make me buy another padlock." That finally earned a genuine laugh from both of them. A few minutes later, only a handful of homeowners remained. One older woman walked toward the pump house carrying a faded photo album tucked beneath her arm. "Nathan," she said, "my husband helped build houses here back in the early 80s. She flipped through several yellowed photographs before stopping on one. "I thought you might want to see this someday." I carefully took the picture. It showed the pump house before the oak trees had grown tall enough to shade it. The concrete walls looked almost new. My grandfather stood beside the freshly installed steel door with several construction workers. Mounted prominently on the front wall was the same brass plaque Deputy Ruiz had uncovered that morning. Across the bottom, someone had written the date in blue ink. October 1981. "I've never seen this picture," I admitted. "I found it after my husband passed away." She smiled softly. "I kept meaning to bring it over." I thanked her and carefully slipped the photograph into one of the empty document folders before carrying everything back toward the truck. Caleb climbed into the driver's seat while I secured the boxes behind us. Before starting the engine, he looked over at me. "You know what's funny?" "What's that?" "We spent all morning proving you own the pump house." He pointed toward the building. "But that's not really what today was about." I smiled. "No, it was about proving your dad was right." I looked out the windshield toward the old concrete building sitting quietly beneath the trees. Dad had never argued much with people who made assumptions. He simply kept records because he believed facts eventually outlasted opinions. At the time, I thought he was overly cautious. Standing there now, surrounded by decades of invoices, surveys, maintenance logs, and photographs, I finally understood he hadn't been preparing for ordinary maintenance. He'd been preserving the ranch's memory for a day neither of us could have predicted. My phone vibrated before I could answer Caleb. The caller ID displayed a local law office I'd never contacted before. I answered. Nathan Brooks. A professional voice introduced himself. Mr. Brooks, my name is David Mercer. My firm represents Hollow Creek Meadows Homeowners Association. Caleb looked over immediately. I switched the phone to speaker. What can I do for you? There was a brief pause before the attorney continued. I've just received copies of today's incident report along with the county records reviewed by the sheriff's office. His tone remained polite and measured. Before I advise my client, I'd like to review the original documents personally. I looked toward the stack of binders beside me. You're welcome to. Thank you. Another short pause followed. Because if those records say what I believe they say. He chose his next words carefully. The HOA board is about to have a very difficult meeting. The following Tuesday, I drove into town carrying the same weathered storage box that had sat in the bed of my truck for years. Nothing about it looked particularly important. The cardboard corners were worn smooth. The labels had faded. One handle had been repaired twice with leather my father stitched on decades earlier. Inside, though, were 40 years of the ranch's history. Every maintenance log, every electrical bill, every survey, every repair invoice, every document that had quietly outlived assumptions. The HOA had scheduled an emergency board meeting at the community clubhouse, and their attorney had asked if I would attend for one reason only. Bring the originals, he had said over the phone. Copies are helpful. Originals and arguments. Caleb insisted on coming with me. As we pulled into the parking lot, he counted the vehicles already there. Looks like half the neighborhood showed up. He wasn't exaggerating. Homeowners filled nearly every parking space. Some carried folders of their own. Others simply wanted to understand how something everyone had accepted for decades could turn out to be wrong. Nobody looked excited anymore. They looked concerned. Inside the clubhouse, the atmosphere felt completely different from every HOA meeting I had attended in the past. There were no raised voices. No one was issuing demands before the meeting had even started. Conversations stayed low, almost cautious. At the front of the room sat attorney David Mercer with several stacks of documents spread neatly across the conference table. Unlike everyone else, he had already organized the records into categories. Survey, operating agreement, developer closing affidavit, county title search, utility history, tax assessments, security footage summary. He stood when I entered. Mr. Brooks. We shook hands. Thank you for coming. I placed the storage box on the table beside him. You wanted the originals. He smiled slightly. I appreciate people who keep them. Vanessa sat quietly near the center of the board table. She looked noticeably different from the woman who had stood on my ranch a week earlier pointing toward the pump house, as though ownership could be declared by confidence alone. She avoided my eyes, not out of anger, but because she already knew where the evidence was leading. Mercer waited until every seat had been filled before beginning. Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent the last several days reviewing every document provided by Brooks Ranch, every county record referenced by the sheriff's office, and every development filing available through the recorder's archive. He rested one hand on the survey map. I also requested independent confirmation from the county title examiner. That immediately caught everyone's attention. No one could claim he had relied only on my paperwork. Mercer continued. All three sources reached the same conclusion. He lifted the original survey first. The water production facility is physically located on Brooks Ranch property. Then the operating agreement. Brooks Ranch retained responsibility for operation, maintenance, electrical service, repair, and physical control. Next came the developer closing affidavit. The developer expressly confirmed that ownership of the facility remained with Brooks Ranch unless transferred through a separately recorded conveyance. Finally, he held up the county title report. No such conveyance has ever been recorded. He placed the papers back on the table in a careful stack. From a legal standpoint, these documents reinforce one another. None contradict the others. Together, they leave very little room for interpretation. The room remained completely silent. Mercer looked toward the board. I asked county staff to search again before this meeting in case something had been overlooked. He paused briefly. Nothing new was found. One homeowner slowly raised his hand. So we've been wrong all these years. Mercer answered honestly. You've been operating under an assumption that was never verified. Another resident frowned. What's the difference? An assumption becomes dangerous when people stop checking whether it's true. Nobody challenged that. Vanessa finally spoke. her voice noticeably softer than anyone in the room had ever heard. "I owe everyone here an apology." Every face turned toward her. She looked down at the documents before continuing. "When I became HOA president, I inherited files from previous boards." She took a slow breath. "The pump house was described as HOA property, and I accepted it without confirming the county records." She glanced briefly toward me. "I should have verified the facts before accusing Mr. Brooks of interfering with something that never belonged to the association." No one interrupted her. Mercer stood again. "Based on my review, I recommend 4 immediate actions." He held up one finger. "First, formally withdraw every ownership claim regarding the Brooks Ranch pump house." A second finger. "Second, reimburse Mr. Brooks for the damaged lock and acknowledge that entry onto the property occurred without legal authority." A third. "Third, execute a written recognition confirming Brooks Ranch ownership of the water production facility so this misunderstanding cannot be repeated by future boards." Finally, a fourth finger. "And fourth, begin planning an independent municipal water connection so the subdivision controls infrastructure it actually owns." Several homeowners exchanged thoughtful looks before nodding. None of the recommendations sounded unreasonable anymore. One after another, the board members voted. Each motion passed unanimously. Even Vanessa voted yes. When the final vote was recorded, Mercer closed his binder and looked toward me. "Mr. Brooks, once the county records this acknowledgement alongside today's resolution, there should never again be any legitimate dispute over ownership of your family's pump house." I looked at the old storage box sitting beside him. My father had packed those papers away believing they might someday matter. Neither of us could have imagined they would end an argument that had quietly grown for more than 40 years. 3 months later, the first thing most people noticed was what they did not hear. There were no more late-night calls asking me to restart pumps the HOA claimed to own. No more certified letters questioning who controlled the pump house. No more rumors drifting across fence lines every time someone misunderstood how the water system worked. Hollow Creek Meadows had completed its new municipal water connection, and for the first time since the subdivision had been built, every homeowner received water from infrastructure the association actually owned. Brooks Ranch returned to the quiet routine it had followed long before the dispute ever began. Most mornings started exactly the same way they always had. Coffee before sunrise. Horses waiting near the barn. A slow walk beneath the live oaks to unlock the old steel door with the same brass key my father once carried in his pocket. The pump house felt different now, not because anything inside had changed, but because the questions surrounding it had finally disappeared. The motors still hummed with the same steady rhythm. The gauges still settled into the same familiar positions. I still signed the maintenance notebook before closing it and placing it back on the shelf where 3 generations of our family's handwriting now rested together. One afternoon, while replacing a worn pressure gauge, a pickup rolled slowly down the ranch driveway. I recognized the driver before he climbed out. It was the older homeowner who had remembered the brass plaque hidden beneath the vines. He carried a flat cardboard envelope under one arm. "Thought I'd stop by," he said. "Found something while cleaning out the attic." We sat on the tailgate of my truck while he carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several original photographs taken during construction of Hollow Creek Meadows in 1981. One showed crews laying subdivision water lines. Another captured my grandfather standing beside the newly completed pump house, smiling in work clothes still covered with concrete dust. The final photograph stopped me for a moment. It had been taken during the dedication of the new system before anyone had moved into the neighborhood. Along the bottom, someone had written a sentence in black marker that time had barely faded. "Neighbors share water. Owners keep title." I smiled without saying anything. The older man laughed softly. "Looks like they settled the whole argument before any of us even showed up." I slipped the photographs into protective sleeves before placing them inside the same storage box that had traveled to the HOA meeting. They belonged there now, alongside the surveys, receipts, and notebooks that had quietly carried the ranch's history through 4 decades. A week later, another truck pulled into the driveway. This time it was the new HOA president. He climbed out holding nothing but a folder and an apologetic smile. "Morning, Nathan." "Morning." He looked toward the pump house beneath the trees. "I wanted to introduce myself." We shook hands. "I've spent the last month reorganizing the association's records." He held up the folder. Every future board member is now required to receive copies of the original development document